On the last episode, diving into the history of our characters in Dissidia Opera Omnia, we last talked about Terra and how she helped forge the way into a faster game state. So naturally, I wanted to cover this character and help players in the community alike as to what happens when the game state is, quote, broken. Our Magitech Spear, one-woman army herself, descended down into Dissidia Opera Omnia and showing all of us who the true superior was in the air. So let's go ahead and talk about the history of Aranea Highwind in Dissidia Opera Omnia. Aranea was first released as the global first during the time of the second anniversary, and players were mostly mixed to see her drop her way into our beloved game. Some players were more on the Where is Riku and Red 13 train, and others were still hoping that one day Sora will find his way into DFFOO.
Huh?
Anyways, after seeing the initial trailer for this character release, the community went into a frenzy, wondering how she will hold up to the current content, being chaos at the time. With the beginning stages of EX Plus still on the rise, would she be a viable character to fully invest in and take advantage of? As we all knew global players how amazing Beatrix was on her initial release. Then players finally got the answer they were asking for. When the video dropped detailing Aranea's kit, she was showered with amazing potencies and then armed with probably the best debuff in global during this time, and that was called Vital Crusher. This debuff was so potent, it would literally change the way chaos fights were approached for the remainder of this era. You see, Vital Crusher was a 2-turn debuff that would allow the entire team to always hit critical brave damage, and that critical brave damage dealt would also be greatly increased. This was so good on so many levels that going into depth on how she completely curb-stomped chaos would keep me here forever, honestly, so I'm going to break it down to her most memorable uses in my opinion. One of those being that Aranea did not care that any boss resisted her range attacks. Thanks to Vital Crusher and a character to enchant the party, like Lulu for example, and Aranea would bypass and delete anything she touched. Secondly, she even dominated the friend unit scene, as the entire list up to Lufenia would simply consist of Aranea, and that's all you really needed because again, her Vital Crusher debuff as well as her S2 being very strong AoE damage, all you had to do was bring the boss to around 50% or below, then simply bring an Aranea to clean up house. A good example of this would be when Kai's event was released. The boss was resistant to range attacks, but was weak against wind. Well, Aranea didn't really care about this, as players still were able to use her as a friend unit and use her to help clean up the final portions of that fight. On top of this, let's just say you didn't kill the boss. Upon leaving, you still had the Vital Crusher debuff on, so you can take full advantage of this potent debuff. Taking both of these points into account, she also delayed with her S1 ability. Her HP plus attack during this time was the best version of any HP plus attack we had available. Her levels were insane, and she was on a whole other level than any other unit at this time could even hope to reach. Despite all of the positives that I just mentioned, there had been such a divide with the community on players who used Aranea and players who didn't, creating a sort of innate challenge between the player base. Players who would actively clear chaos content would post their runs proud, but then another player noticing Aranea would immediately in a way disregard this as a true run, since running Aranea made the run GG easy, as some players would say. Now I truly never understood this as a negative, since I would always side with if you can rid yourself of the BS this game throws at you, especially in Lufenia Plus, I'm 99.9% going to be choosing that route. The less of a headache the better. But what I also didn't understand about this point is that Aranea makes a majority of the chaos fights completely brain dead, and that using her would almost always assume you are going to win. And a good comparison to trivializing content like this is when SAS35CP came out early in Global, where fights just seemed so much easier to deal with as long as you had SAS with you. This of course was noticed by the dev team, but the sad part about this is that I feel like some of the community may not understand is that Aranea was utterly overpowered for the time period in which she was released in. Her output of damage was off the charts, and she was completely untouchable. The hype behind this is what paved the way in some of the community's mind, where all of the global first should, with this intent behind them of being completely and utterly overpowered in the early time period they may have been released in. though Aranea was such a high point that topping a character like this was just impossible to overcome. As you can see from the very loud chatter that Vincent LD and Balthier LD came from, the community, you can see that the players were focused on one thing and one thing only: damage. And how much can this character dish out? Vivi was spared from this as he can reliably output high damage. Not as much as Aranea did, of course, but he was decent enough. Going forward, and with the release of Aranea's LD weapon, the set hype for her was already so dismal, to the point where at first glance, may have seemed that no one was excited for Aranea to make yet another return, but at this point in the game, her LD gave her great additions to her kit. For example, she could re-brick no matter what now, which would imply that we can upkeep her overclock buff that much longer. Did you notice how I never mentioned Aranea's kit and buff throughout this entire video? And for good reason. Her kit was at initial release was completely crazy for this early stage of Global to handle, and her Vital Crusher debuff solidified her as the top DPS unit for months. Overclock was just added salt to the many wounds Aranea would be leaving behind on her enemies. Despite the massive wake of this character and the uproar and divide that started to occur, I have high hopes for any other global firsts that may still continue to happen. The devs, of course, are more aware of how something is released into the global version of the game. At least we'd like to think they are more aware of another possible Aranea. You cannot factually deny, though, that when she was introduced into the game, the community and the state of the game was changed forever. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and if you feel like I deserve it, please go ahead and subscribe and leave a like, as it helps the channel grow as well as lets me continue to make this content for all of you to enjoy. I want to go ahead and give a special shout out to GallonOPCP as well as Soul1305, who helped provide some of the footage you see in this video, as well as the Tonberry Troupe and Dissidia database, where majority of information for today's video was found. Thank you so much again, everyone, and as always, I'll see you next time.